Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Robert Daly. Robert is director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. He joins us today to talk about this new defense alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US that caused some strong reactions from China. And that's what we're going to talk about, the Chinese reaction. Robert, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be back with you.
So, Robert, when you looked at coverage that morning when the story broke about this arrangement between the three allies, it was framed universally around the globe as a surprise announcement. Did it come as a surprise to the Chinese?
I think the specifics of it, yes, were a surprise, and probably a surprise that rocked them back on their heels a little bit. And interestingly, the telltale for that is that they've been relatively quiet. And they've said the things that you would expect them to say, that they say for one reason or another almost every other day, which is that the United States is a failing hegemon, that its alliances are a sign of a doomed Cold War mentality. They repeated the usual playbook, but other than that, didn't have something specific to say. And I suspect that that's because they knew that this was actually the first major move of its kind from the Biden administration, and that it required them to some degree to reassess. And so I think that's why we haven't seen, the kinds of vitriol or clear statements we'd expect from their spokesman.
Given, often a surprise with the benefit of hindsight becomes somewhat predictable. And did China expect that there would be some pushback based on its activities in the South China Sea?
Well, of course, this is pushback based on a lot of different Chinese activities. And it goes back, as you mentioned, really to 2016 with the build out of artificial islands and then the militarization of those islands. And then the very strong implicit claim, which violates the finding of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, that China has territorial seas connected to those islands. I think that's what really raised awareness around the world. But this is also a response to China's economic coercion against Australia over the past year, which has been sudden, pervasive, and I think to most people's way of thinking, out of all proportion to the so-called provocation. The so-called provocation being Australia's calling for an independent international scientific examination of the origins of COVID. And China has been relentless in its attempts to punish Australia since. And that surely is one of the factors that plays into Australia's decision to finally say, we can't put chips on red and black. We've got to put them all on one side. And that's what Australia has done here. The question, I think, for Beijing watchers is how much second guessing is there now in China about whether Xi Jinping has overreached and overplayed his hand? Because this is one of the strongest instances of blowback, but it's very far from being the only one in most parts of the world. And this we see in public opinion polls in which China is more distrusted than ever and more distrusted than the United States, despite the failures of the Trump administration. We see it in places like Lithuania, which is pushing back very hard against China. It's all around the world. And so I think the interesting question, which we won't know the answer to for quite some time, is whether there's a rethink about whether China has moved too far too fast.
Mm-hmm. So what you're describing, in essence, you're saying we're not yet sure if this is a trend?
Right. China will obviously see the opportunities in this, opportunities which in part are of our own creation. They realize, of course, France's nose is badly out of joint. Does this present an opportunity for China to drive a wedge between transatlantic coordination on countering China? In particular, can they use France's peak to resuscitate their mutual investment treaty with Europe, which has been put on ice by the Europeans? They'll be attentive to that sort of opportunity. They also are attentive to opportunities in Southeast Asia. And this, I think, was fairly deft on China's part. Within 24 hours of our announcement of the formation of Aukus, they announced their formal application to the CPTPP, which is the organization that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, became after President Trump announced America's disinterest in it. Some people say that he pulled out of TPP. We were never technically in, but he put a stake through its heart from America's point of view. And so we made a move on the military side. China countered with economic signaling in an area that is all about economics. And even though China has no clear path to joining the CPTPP, that's going to be a very heavy lift for a number of reasons. It was an important reminder of the fact that China is the major trading partner for most countries in this region. And I hope that it will be seen as a reminder to us that we need to be equally active on the economic front. You know, we've responded now vigorously militarily to China, but we have not responded as well diplomatically or economically. We still don't have an assistant secretary of state for East Asia Pacific. We don't have an ambassador in China or Singapore or in most other countries. So my hope is that this move will be followed by, as President Biden said at the UN, an onslaught of diplomacy. And then I hope an onslaught of economic activity in the Indo-Pacific, which will give us the kind of credibility we need.
When the Aukus announcement was made, Biden, Morrison, Johnson almost went out of their way to not mention China explicitly. But did China see it as anything other than all about China?
No, of course not. I mean, China sees everything as being all about China, even when it isn't. So when it is, they are certainly not going to miss that one. And they see the Biden administration now building a series of organizations. You know, he already had, of course, our alliance system in Asia, and we have the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network between the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. We have been convincing NATO that it needs to see itself as having a China mission. We are working on the Quad, this still mostly aspirational arrangement between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, and President Biden will meet with leaders of those countries tomorrow, and now AUKUS. And so China sees this web very clearly. They know it's about containing China. One more thought about all of these different alliances and moves we're making. If you draw lines connecting the involved countries in each of these arrangements, an awful lot of those lines cross in Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia experiences that as putting them in the crosshairs of US-Chinese competition, which is not where they want to be. They are very worried about a growing arms race in their region, where their concern is development and economics. And so it is imperative that we get deeply involved with these nations, diplomatically and economically now, because they're extremely worried about the moves we've made. And Malaysia just announced that they want to send a delegation to Beijing to gauge Beijing's response to the AUKUS announcement. We need to be part of these discussions. We need to get Southeast Asia closer to the center of our map because they feel like the moves that we make have put them there and are potentially dangerous to them.
So you know, my words, not yours, but you described a bit of a deer in the headlights reaction initially, that there was surprise among China, and some of that you're interpreting based on their relative silence. Do they have any interest in responding to this AUKUS agreement through a military buildup of any kind, or will they continue as they did in the attempt to join the trade alliance? Will they continue to emphasize economics?
They will certainly continue to emphasize economics, but I think that they will ramp up, for example, their fairly provocative flights and cruises near to Taiwan. I would expect to see them increase the number of joint military exercises with Russia. For example, they will certainly respond in the military sphere. Some of that may be symbolic. Some of it, I say, building joint capabilities with Russia, which is not an ally, but a strategic partner. And then, of course, the timeline for actually getting these new Australian nuclear-powered subs into the water is a long one. 2040 earliest, if everything goes smoothly. And this will certainly mean that China will be doing a great deal more to try to develop better technology, both to detect and to take out submarines, something that they lag in right now, but they've got a ways to go between now and 2040. So this does point, rightly or wrongly, we could have another discussion about that, to, yes, an increasing arms race of a new sort in the Indo-Pacific, and it will involve gray zone tactics and work on the cyber side. It will be largely technological rather than a positioning of large armies. But China will, adjust its force structure and adjust its investments based on an understanding that Australia is going to be down there.
This notion that President Xi might be overreaching, does this amount to a significant chink in the armor or a minor chink in the armor?
Again, we don't know. China remains a black box, but there has been an awful lot of blowback to China's Belt and Road Initiative in Europe and in many other parts of the world. I said China knows that reputationally it has suffered greatly over the past few years throughout the world, that very few countries share China's sense that its regional preeminence is natural and inevitable and desirable. They're getting blowback at almost every point of the compass. The question is, how much is that increasing pressure from within the Chinese Communist Party on Xi Jinping, who, if he has overreached internationally, and my view is that he has, he's also making huge bets domestically. And we can talk about this perhaps in another session, in his crackdowns on corporations and culture, in which he's trying to remake the country for a new era in a way that a lot of Chinese will not welcome. So is he overreaching not only internationally, but also domestically? And if so, how is that likely to play out? That's a conversation for another day. But we know that he makes big moves, that he's about control, and he's also fairly consistent. Once he launches an effort of this kind, it tends to be sustained. So as I said earlier, I don't think we'll know for a long time what this is doing to debates within the Chinese leadership itself.
Well, we'll definitely, I'll take you up on that. We'll definitely dive deeper on that in a future conversation. But a closing thought on this one, stepping back from the particulars of the Aukus deal and of the Quad meetings that are, as we make this recording, that are imminent. What would be the appropriate strategy, do you think, from the perspective of the United States that would have traction with the Chinese? Is it continuing this competitive, almost gamesmanship, chess moves challenging? Is it a bold attempt to create partnerships where there are opportunities for partnerships? What do you think really makes the most sense moving forward?
Well, I do think that strengthening the alliances, strengthening our international partnerships, and moving on diplomatic, economic, and to some degree military fronts all make sense and is all quite necessary. I think that it would be very helpful if, while doing that, we could tone down the rhetoric considerably and create space for dialogue. This move with Australia and the UK does not preclude dialogue with China from China's point of view. They would be happy to meet on this if they didn't feel that United States rhetoric was committed to insulting and demeaning and harming China 24/7. Moves of the sort you said, sort of the chess game, I do this, you do that. China's quite comfortable with that. This is a mature nation. But what they see as the constant rhetorical assault makes dialogue difficult, and we need dialogue.
It's amazing when you talk about either individuals or nations. It often comes down to respect, doesn't it?
Yes, and of course, respect is a pretty sticky wicket because it's in the eye of the receiver, right? And
Yeah,
China can always
sure.
claim to feel disrespected when we've intended no disrespect, and now we're having a talk about feelings instead of issues. So it's one of the constant irritants in the relationship. But yes, we do need, I think, to tone down the rhetoric, but not change our basic policy stance pursuant to beginning meaningful dialogues with China.
Well, Robert, we always appreciate your ability to cut through the rhetoric and give us some clear thinking about what's happening. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of Wilson Center Now. I hope you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.